time to get started. Oh no, yeah, episode 1, that is 01, the episode I'm titling, Are You Interested? Let's find out if you're interested by throwing some provocative and hopefully interesting questions at you, like this. Is your ideology the best guide to helping us relieve widespread, sustained suffering? What about those proponents of contrary ideologies who claim theirs is the best? Can your ideology relieve their suffering too, even if they keep rejecting your ideology forever? Did you acquire your ideology because it really is the best, or because your family and community would otherwise shun or kill you? Next question is, what truth criteria are you using to claim your ideology is truly the best? The truth criteria specified by your ideology, of course. Does your ideology's truth criteria contradict itself or have other logical problems? And of what consequence can logic be to relieving suffering? Can you even answer that question without relying on logic? Would you follow the advice of an ideology that prescribed transferring your consciousness to a beautiful android body that could live indefinitely without significant pain? Would you do that? Could you really trust that your consciousness would in fact be transferred as opposed to killed and replaced by a copy? Would you follow the advice of an ideology that prescribed abandoning every core value you have and adopting new ones just because they're more compatible with happiness? Or would you see that as equivalent to killing yourself and giving your body to someone so different from you that you cannot see yourself in them? Do these questions interest you? These are the kinds of questions I hope to address in this podcast show. And by presenting them at the very beginning of this episode, I hope to get you interested in continuing to watch. Also, these are the kinds of questions I find important to address when we evaluate ideologies in terms of how well they help us relieve widespread, sustained suffering. In fact, their importance to me prompts me to initiate a project of compiling a list of such questions. And I invite you to help me with this project. And of course, these questions serve as a guide to further episodes of this show. We may unpack and analyze each of these questions with several threads of episodes devoted to many of them. But before I get that list project started, I want to restate the goal of the show, which might seem more appealing now that I have teased you with those questions at the beginning. So here's the goal of the show restated in case I haven't stated it before. This show encourages using logic to figure out how we can relieve widespread, sustained suffering. Relief of widespread, sustained suffering is the goal. Deep, logical thinking is the means. I suspect almost everyone has some assumptions about how best to relieve widespread, sustained suffering. Here on this show, I want to subject these assumptions to deeper analysis, to examine their premises and arguments, and to thereby gain new and useful insights about relieving suffering. Okay, so that's the goal. Now let's get back to that list of provocative questions and topics. The topic issue list project. Obviously, I have already started compiling the list, but This list is an ongoing project, and this list project is collaborative, in that I invite watchers to contribute items to it and help organize the items into subcategories via emails and YouTube or whatever platform comments. I may start a group on some internet platform or some cloud service to hold documents such as this list. Oh, and items on the list need not be strictly expressed as questions. The list is really for topics or issues. Many of the topics and issues are just more provocatively expressed as direct questions. And that's why I try to express them as such when trying to generate interest. But they need not be expressed as direct questions like that. So feel free to suggest any issue or topic in any form, question or otherwise, that seems natural to you. Some issues and topics have a special status for me, such that they belong in a special subcategory. These issues have the effect of presenting a challenge to any ideology, such that the answer offered by the ideology might reveal a serious flaw in that ideology's ability to help us relieve suffering. One crucial example of such a challenge issue is, what does this ideology plan to do with people who reject it? Can this ideology relieve their suffering as well, even as they continue to reject the ideology? So another project is to compile a sublist of these challenge issues, again, often expressed in terms of direct questions like that. And so the rest of this episode is just me presenting these lists. And so here is my list of topics and issues, often expressed as both noun phrases and questions. Many of them are repeats of the questions I presented at the beginning of this episode, but I want to present them again as part of a more complete list here. I'll just keep presenting them until I run out of time, continuing into the next episode if need be. But note that in my list of topics, I often use the phrase relief theory as a substitute for the word ideology. I likely did this because I found relief theory a bit more precise. So here goes. The general issues and provocative questions. Okay, what is suffering? It seems we are often confused about what suffering is, and this can cause problems in our general quest to relieve suffering. So it seems we can increase our efficiency at relieving suffering by clarifying what suffering is and acting on that clarity. What kind of suffering to relieve first? I keep mentioning widespread and sustained suffering as the kinds of suffering to relieve. By these I mean things like disease, scarcities of food, shelter, love, and sexual gratification. I just assume that of all the kinds of suffering to relieve, widespread and sustained suffering would naturally be our highest priority. But how valid is my assumption? Do other people even exist who can therefore suffer? This is basically the philosophical problem of other minds. Do other minds exist? Can you know whether other minds exist and suffer? And if you can't know for sure, do you still want to act as if you were sure that other minds existed and try to relieve their suffering, just in case? Why try to relieve suffering? We may be surprised to find that people differ in their stated reasons for trying to relieve suffering. What are some of these differences? And how do these differences impact our ability to relieve suffering? Why we lack compassion, i.e., the motivation to relieve the suffering of others. We can be baffled and frustrated by the general lack of compassion, the lack of motivation to relieve the suffering of others. If suffering is so horrible and widespread, why aren't we doing more to relieve it? Whether we lack compassion without knowing that we lack compassion. It is possible, or the question is it possible to believe we are very compassionate without realizing we actually lack compassion? This brings up the issue I mentioned in the previous episode, that is episode 00, a meta episode, namely whether there is such a thing as a Jungian shadow that makes us believe we are more compassionate than we really are, as well as a collectivized extension of our individual Jungian shadows that makes us believe our public plans to relieve suffering are more compassionate than they actually are. It could be argued that we do have these Jungian shadows and have them as a consequence of evolution, such that 1. Callousness and malevolence has so far been a survival advantage to our species as a whole, and 2. Being in denial of our callousness and malevolence is still an additional survival advantage. So it could be argued, but is it true? Whether suffering can be relieved. Can all, or even most, suffering be relieved? Or are we doomed to endure great suffering for as long as we exist? Whether suffering can really be relieved by changing our core values. If we relieve someone's suffering by changing their core values, are they really even the same person? If not, then did we really relieve their suffering? Or did we just kill their old self and replace it with a new self who doesn't suffer? Does most suffering come from our relationship with inanimate nature, or our relationship with other sentient creatures? What causes most of our suffering? The hardships of inanimate nature, or the conflicts we have with other sentient creatures? Does most of our suffering come more fundamentally from the innate nature or the inflictions from other sentient creatures? What is the most fundamental cause of our suffering? The hardships of inanimate nature or the conflicts we have with other sentient creatures? If one of these two causes of suffering were eliminated, would the other diminish as well? The answers we give to this one tend to divide across classic political divisions. Conservatives seem most likely to say that the most fundamental cause of our suffering is inanimate nature. Progressives seem most likely to say that the most fundamental cause of suffering is the conflicts we have with other humans. To say, for example, that whatever hurts us is a social construct. Whether we can know we relieve the suffering of others. How do we, social engineers, know if and when we are succeeding at relieving widespread suffering? If the people of the world tell us that we are succeeding at relieving their suffering, are they telling us the truth, or just playing along to fit in, or to avoid retribution from we social engineers? Another major heading in the list is the hazards of false relief theories. Such questions come up as, do false relief theories help or hinder our efforts to relieve suffering? More specifically, how much suffering can be relieved by a false theory? Can a false relief theory still be effective at relieving suffering? If so, how? And to what degree? Can a false relief theory still work by way of a placebo effect? Can a false relief theory still work by a kind of placebo effect? What I mean here is this. It may be that a relief theory is false, bullshit, but that believing in it still relieves suffering to a significant degree, as the mere expectation that suffering will end tends to reduce suffering right now. It might also be that a false relief theory reduces suffering by way of providing access to the physical and emotional comforts available in a community of one's fellow believers in the theory. And if this placebo effect is valid, can it explain why so many people might commit to false relief theories? And if so, can this phenomenon be used to explain why there is a plethora of relief theories, many of which conflict with one another? Whether a panic theory is valid. What I call the panic theory holds that most people commit to a false relief theory for the placebo benefits, motivated by a kind of panicked search for a theory that provides acceptable, immediate relief. And as we panic this way, we often make things worse for humanity as a whole, as we inflict suffering on one another in our conflicts over which relief theory is the true savior. This is why I call it a panic theory. Panicking often makes things worse. So the question here is, how true is this panic theory? If the panic theory is true, can we still execute an effective relief theory? If the world is basically panicking and making things worse, is there a way to relieve widespread suffering despite our panicking? To overcome the hindrances of a panic theory, it seems we'd have to posit that a non-panicking, rational minority would have to rise to power and execute their relief plan without the approval of the very world's population they are trying to rescue. Is this even possible? Or would these otherwise rational elite become corrupted by their acquired power? If the panic theory is true, might we still relieve widespread suffering by accident? Given that the panic theory is true, what are the chances that we might accidentally stumble upon the cure for our suffering in spite of our panicking? Of course, our panicking is currently making things worse, but maybe we'll accidentally discover something or do something that quickly turns things around and heads us towards a rapid cure for widespread sustained suffering. Can such an event be predicted? Next major category in this list, I guess, is which relief theory is true, i.e. the best at relieving suffering. Whether changing external circumstances or internal attitudes will relieve suffering best. Which is the more effective way to relieve widespread suffering? Make the objective world comply with our subjective desires, or make our subjective desires comply with the objective world? In other words, forcefully get what we want, or learn to want what we get. Whether morality helps or hinders our efforts to relieve suffering. Is morality really aimed at relieving widespread suffering? Or is morality a psychological con game, i.e. Jungian shadow collectivization, by which we rationalize relieving the suffering of Group A at the expense of hurting Group B? Even deeper, what is the exact relationship between morality and the relief of suffering? Is there really any logically consistent relationship between moral duty and the relief of suffering? To what degree can we relieve suffering by drugging our minds? Yeah, are drugs the ultimate cure for widespread sustained suffering? Do we need the consent of those whose suffering we relieve? Suppose you had a ray gun that relieved the suffering of anyone you shot with it. They might object to being shot, but once you did shoot them, they would be glad you did, no matter how much they had objected. Would you shoot them without their consent to relieve their suffering? What if the relief effects of the ray gun were only temporary and could be programmed to last for various lengths of time? Would this fact make it easier to violate their consent? Can we even know which relief theory is true, i.e. the best? If there is a single true and best relief theory, can we identify it with any certainty? What if we can't know which relief theory is true? If we can't identify the single best and true relief theory, can we create a kind of meta-theory that tells us what to do if we find out that we've been trying a false relief theory? Perhaps this would be a policy of cautiously trying many approaches and having the flexibility to abandon those that seem to fail. Could such a policy work? Does the relief of widespread suffering require that we all agree on how to relieve it? It seems that we inflict suffering on one another over disagreements about how best to relieve suffering. This situation might make us wonder whether the suffering we inflict on one another is greater than the suffering we're trying to relieve by the very theory we champion in the conflict. For example, all religions promise relief from suffering, but is that relief worth the inflicted sufferings of the wars between the religions? And if so, are there exceptions to this? Do we all need to agree on how best to relieve suffering in order to relieve it? Or can we disagree and still relieve it? How do theories of truth and knowledge affect our efforts to relieve suffering? When we disagree about how to relieve suffering, we often find that our disagreements are rooted in deeper disagreements over the nature of truth and knowledge. So when our polemics arrive at this issue, is there any way to resolve the issue? Is there a demonstrably valid and true theory of truth and knowledge that refutes all others? Even if there were, would people still reject it for emotional reasons, out of panic? And if we can't resolve this issue, does that condemn us to everlasting conflicts over how best to relieve suffering? And if so, will these everlasting conflicts themselves remain a source of suffering? Whether suffering is best relieved by plans based on realism or plans based on idealism. I mean realism and idealism in the metaphysical, epistemological, core philosophy sense, rather than entertainment or art, poetry, that sort of thing. Is suffering best relieved by believing that reality is absolute and has very few options open to us, or that reality is subject to our minds, or the collective mind of society, and therefore has potentially more options open to us? Whether artificial intelligence can relieve our suffering. If we humans aren't smart enough to figure out how to relieve widespread sustained suffering, can we humans create an artificial intelligence superior to our own that can actually figure it out? An implicit relief theory called transhumanism seems to say we can, and predicts that we will. Whether suffering can be relieved by transferring our consciousness to a supercomputer, virtual reality, or a more durable robot body. Can we escape our suffering by escaping our mortal, decaying organic bodies? Can our consciousness transfer from organic brain to some other kind of computational substance? Can we thereby transfer our consciousness to a supercomputer in which we enjoy a life of pleasures in a kinder and gentler reality? Whether the scarcity of bodily physical beauty is a significant cause of widespread sustained suffering. Many people lack bodily physical beauty and are ugly, such that physically beautiful people refuse to affectionately touch them. Do such ugly people suffer much for this? Is this a significant cause of suffering, on par with starvation and disease and the ravages of war? This is an extremely complicated and controversial issue to tackle, but I do want to tackle it because I worry that bodily ugliness actually does cause significant suffering. If the scarcity of bodily physical beauty does cause significant suffering, can we relieve this suffering? If bodily ugliness does cause significant suffering, can we cure it? If so, how? Is beauty and ugliness a social construct that can be reconstructed along more egalitarianish lines through political action? Or is it biologically fixed at birth, such that only some advanced medical science of some distant future can cure it? Or some mixture of both? That's about the end of that list there. Ending commentary. It's possible to guess where I stand on some of these issues based solely on my very decision to include them on the list of issues. You can get a glimpse at my biases by looking at the things I find important about widespread sustained suffering versus what things I left off the list. For example, I did not talk about God as if God were crucially relevant to the relief of suffering. This is a bias of mine. Is my bias correct or misguided? If you emailed me to demand that I include our relationship with God as completely crucial to any discussion of relieving suffering, I would comply with your demand, but I will insist that our discussion of any relationship with God would be bracketed in a big if, as in the following discussion is only relevant if God actually exists. There are other issues in the realm of relieving suffering that I'd bracket in big ifs. I hope this kind of if bracketing is a useful tool in our discussions generally as a way for people with conflicting biases to have productive discussion. And core questions for proponents of candidate relief theories. Okay. And now for the special challenge issue subcategory list. As another ongoing project, I have this idea of collecting a set of provocative questions to ask every proponent of a candidate relief theory. These questions would be designed to get people thinking about their candidate relief theory in new ways that might challenge their assumptions about that candidate relief theory. I invite you to suggest such questions. Here are some of the questions I have so far conceived. You've heard this one several times before. How does the candidate relief theory handle people who oppose it? And does the candidate relief theory relieve the suffering of those who oppose it? Even them? Even if they continue to oppose it? For the theory to work, how many people have to deliberately support and execute the theory? What percentage of the population? How many of the rich and powerful must support it? Okay, that's it. That's all for this episode. Thank you for watching and listening. I don't know what to cover next, so I'll need to figure that one out. But whatever I do cover next, I hope you will stay with me for future episodes. Bye.